The wind howled through the bare branches of the cottonwoods as Detective Maria Santos pulled her cruiser into the gravel parking lot of the Flathead County Sheriff's Department. Steam rose from her coffee cup in the frigid February air, and she could see her breath forming small clouds as she hurried toward the building's entrance. The morning temperature had dropped to -15 degrees, typical for northwestern Montana in the dead of winter. Maria had been with the department for 12 years, working her way up from patrol officer to detective, specializing in cold cases that others had given up on. At 38, she had developed a reputation for her dogged persistence and ability to see patterns that others missed. Her colleagues often joked that she could find connections between cases that seemed completely unrelated, but Maria knew it was more than intuition. It was careful attention to detail and an unwillingness to let the dead stay silent. As she settled at her desk, Maria noticed a manila envelope that hadn't been there the night before. Her name was written across the front in Sheriff Thompson's distinctive handwriting. Inside, she found a faded Polaroid photograph and a brief note. "Maria, this came in yesterday's mail. Anonymous sender. Thought you might want to take a look. The scarf matches evidence from the Whitmore case." "Jim." Maria held the photograph up to her desk lamp, studying it carefully. The image showed a young girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, standing beside a frozen creek. Snow-covered pine trees stretched endlessly in the background, and the girl wore a bright red scarf that seemed to glow against the winter landscape. Her blonde hair peeked out from beneath a knitted cap, and her smile was innocent and trusting. At the bottom of the photo, someone had written in faded ink, "Sarah, Winter Creek, December 1979. The name hit Maria like a physical blow. Sarah Whitmore. She had studied that case file dozens of times over the years, memorizing every detail of the 8-year-old girl who had vanished without a trace during Christmas vacation in 1979. The case had haunted the department for decades, remaining stubbornly unsolved despite numerous investigations and false leads. Maria pulled the thick file from her cabinet, her hands trembling slightly as she opened it. The first page contained Sarah's school photo, the same blonde hair, the same trusting smile, but it was the evidence list that made her heart race. Item #47, red knitted scarf with distinctive cable pattern, found frozen in Winter Creek, 3 miles northeast of victim's home. She compared the scarf in the photograph to the crime scene photos. There was no doubt. They were the same. The cable pattern was identical, right down to a small section where a few stitches had come loose near the fringe. Maria's phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. "Detective Santos." "Maria, it's Dr. Patricia Wells from the State Crime Lab. I've got news about that scarf from the Whitmore case. The DNA results came back from the new analysis." Maria's pulse quickened. 6 months ago, she had convinced the department to submit the scarf for advanced DNA testing using techniques that hadn't existed in 1979. The original investigation had found no usable biological evidence, but modern technology could often extract DNA from sources previously thought impossible. "What did you find?" "We got a partial profile from epithelial cells embedded in the wool fibers. Not enough for a full match, but enough to run through the database. Maria, we got a hit." The coffee cup slipped from Maria's hand, spilling across her desk. "You're kidding me." "Robert Henley, 67 years old, currently residing in Whitefish. He's in the system because of a DUI arrest last year. The partial DNA is consistent with his profile." Maria frantically searched through her files. Robert Henley. The name was familiar, but she couldn't immediately place it. Then she found it, buried in the witness statements from the original investigation. Robert Henley had been the Whitmore family's neighbor in 1979, living just 2 houses down from where Sarah had disappeared. He had been questioned briefly, but cleared when he provided an alibi. "Dr. Wells, how confident are you in this match? Given the partial nature of the sample, I'd say there's about a 15% chance of error, but combined with the circumstantial evidence and the fact that he was already connected to the case, I think you've got probable cause for an arrest." Maria thanked Dr. Wells and immediately called Sheriff Thompson. Within an hour, she was driving north toward Whitefish, the anonymous photograph secured in an evidence bag on the passenger seat, the same photograph that someone had mailed to the sheriff's department 46 years after it was taken. As she drove through the snow-covered valleys and pine forests of northwestern Montana, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah Whitmore was somehow guiding this investigation from beyond the grave. The timing was too perfect, the evidence too precisely delivered. Someone wanted Robert Henley to be caught, and Maria intended to make sure they got their wish. The Winter Creek area looked much the same as it had in 1979, though the old Whitmore house had been torn down years ago. Maria pulled over at the creek where Sarah's scarf had been found, now flowing freely despite the bitter cold. She stared at the water, wondering what secrets it had kept for nearly half a century. Her radio crackled to life. "Detective Santos, this is dispatch. We've located Robert Henley at his residence. Units are standing by for your arrival." Maria took one last look at the creek, then climbed back into her cruiser. After 46 years, Sarah Whitmore was finally going to get the justice she deserved. Robert Henley's house sat at the end of a gravel driveway, surrounded by towering Douglas firs. The modest ranch-style home looked well-maintained despite its age, with fresh paint and carefully shoveled walkways. Smoke curled from the chimney into the grey afternoon sky, and Maria could see warm light glowing through the curtained windows. She parked behind 2 patrol units and walked toward the front door, her boots crunching on the packed snow. Deputies Morrison and Clark flanked the entrance, their expressions tense but professional. Maria had worked with both men for years and trusted their judgment completely. "Has he said anything?" Maria asked quietly. "Not a word," Deputy Morrison replied. "We explained we needed to speak with him about an ongoing investigation. He invited us in, offered coffee, acting completely normal, like he's got nothing to hide." Maria studied the house more carefully. Through a gap in the curtains, she could see bookshelves lining the walls and what appeared to be old family photographs displayed on the mantel. Everything looked ordinary, almost disappointingly normal for the home of someone who might be a child killer. She knocked firmly on the front door. After a moment, it opened to reveal a man in his late 60s with silver hair and kind eyes, behind wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a cardigan sweater and house slippers, looking more like someone's grandfather than a murder suspect. "Mr. Henley, I'm Detective Santos with the Flathead County Sheriff's Department. We spoke on the phone earlier." "Of course, Detective. Please come in out of the cold." His voice was steady, showing no signs of nervousness or guilt. "I was just making some hot chocolate. Would you care for some?" Maria followed him into a cozy living room dominated by a stone fireplace. The walls were indeed covered with bookshelves, filled with volumes on local history, wildlife, and classic literature. Family photographs showed Robert at various ages, as a young man in military uniform, at wedding celebrations, holding what appeared to be grandchildren. "Mr. Henley, I need to ask you about something that happened a long time ago. Do you remember the Whitmore family? They lived on Maple Street back in 1979. Robert's expression shifted slightly, a shadow passing across his features. "The Whitmores? Yes, of course. Terrible thing that happened to their little girl. Sarah, wasn't it? She disappeared right around Christmas time." "That's right. You were questioned as part of the original investigation since you lived nearby. I remember giving a statement to the police. I was at my brother's house in Missoula that weekend, helping him move into a new apartment. Had receipts, witnesses, the whole thing." Robert settled into his recliner, his hands folded calmly in his lap. "Detective, surely you're not reopening that case after all these years?" Maria pulled out the evidence bag containing the photograph. "Mr. Henley, have you ever seen this picture before?" Robert took the bag and studied the image through the plastic. For just a moment his composure slipped, and Maria caught a flash of something in his eyes. Recognition, fear, or perhaps something else entirely. "This is Sarah, isn't it?" he said quietly. "She's wearing that red scarf she was so proud of. Her grandmother knitted it for her birthday. How do you know about the scarf, Mr. Henley?" "Well, Robert hesitated, seeming to choose his words carefully. "The whole neighborhood knew about that scarf. Sarah wore it everywhere once the weather got cold. She was so excited about it, always showing it off to anyone who would look." Maria made a note in her pad. "Mr. Henley, I need to inform you that we've recovered DNA evidence from Sarah's scarf, and it matches your genetic profile." The color drained from Robert's face. He set the photograph down with shaking hands and stared into the fireplace for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "That's not possible. I never touched that scarf. I barely knew the family." "The science doesn't lie, Mr. Henley. We have a partial DNA match linking you to physical evidence from the crime scene." Robert stood up abruptly and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered yard. "Detective Santos, I need you to understand something. I've lived with the guilt of that night for 46 years, but not for the reasons you think." Maria leaned forward in her chair. "What do you mean?" "I saw her that night, December 23rd, 1979. I was coming home from the grocery store around 9 o'clock When I saw Sarah walking down Maple Street by herself, she was crying and looked lost. I should have stopped, should have helped her get home safely. Robert turned back to face Maria, tears streaming down his cheeks. Instead, I drove past because I was late for a Christmas party. I told myself someone else would help her, that her parents would find her. I've regretted that decision every single day since. Mr. Henley, that still doesn't explain how your DNA ended up on her scarf. I don't know how to explain that, Detective, but I swear to you on my mother's grave that I never hurt that child. I never even spoke to her. Maria studied his face, looking for signs of deception. Robert Henley appeared genuinely distraught, but she had seen convincing performances from guilty suspects before. The DNA evidence was solid, regardless of how sincere he seemed. Mr. Henley, I'm going to need you to come down to the station for further questioning. You have the right to remain silent. As Maria read him his Miranda rights, Robert nodded numbly and asked for his coat. But as they prepared to leave, something caught Maria's attention. On the mantel, partially hidden behind a larger family photo, was a small framed picture that made her blood run cold. It showed a young Robert Henley, probably in his early 20s, standing beside Winter Creek. The photograph appeared to be from the late 1970s, and in the background, barely visible through the trees, was the distinctive red roof of the old Whitmore house. Robert had been lying about how well he knew the area around Sarah's home. The question was, what else had he been lying about? The fluorescent lights in interview room B buzzed with an irritating persistence that seemed to match the tension in the air. Maria sat across from Robert Henley, who had declined his right to an attorney, and seemed eager to tell his story. His hands trembled slightly as he accepted a cup of coffee from Deputy Morrison. Mr. Henley, let's start from the beginning. You said you saw Sarah on the night she disappeared. Tell me exactly what you remember. Robert took a sip of coffee and closed his eyes, as if trying to summon the memory from decades past. It was snowing lightly, and the streetlights made everything look soft and peaceful. I had stayed late at the grocery store because they were having a sale on Christmas decorations. My wife Helen had given me a list as long as my arm. Your wife Helen? I don't see her mentioned in the original case files. Helen passed away in 1983. Cancer. We'd only been married 3 years when Sarah disappeared. Robert's voice carried a weight of old grief. She always blamed me for not stopping that night, said it was my Christian duty to help a child in distress. She was right, of course. Maria made notes as he spoke, watching his body language for inconsistencies. What exactly did you see when you passed Sarah on the street? She was walking toward the creek area, away from her house. That struck me as odd because it was past her bedtime, and it was bitterly cold that night. She had her arms wrapped around herself, and she kept looking back over her shoulder like someone was following her. Did you see anyone else in the area? Robert was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. There was a car parked near the end of Maple Street, dark-colored, maybe blue or black. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, it seemed out of place. Most folks on that street knew each other's vehicles. Maria felt her pulse quicken. A dark car had been mentioned by one other witness in the original investigation, but the detail had been dismissed as unreliable. Can you describe the car in more detail? It was older, maybe from the early 70s. Had one of those long, boxy shapes that cars used to have. I remember thinking the engine sounded rough, like it needed a tune-up. Mr. Henley, I need to ask you directly, how did your DNA end up on Sarah's scarf? Robert's composure cracked and he buried his face in his hands. Detective, I've been asking myself that same question since you told me about the test results. The only time I can remember being close enough to Sarah to have any physical contact was... He paused, seeming to struggle with the memory. Take your time, Mr. Henley. It was about a week before she disappeared. I was shoveling my driveway when I heard crying from next door. Sarah had fallen off her bicycle and scraped her knee pretty badly. Her parents weren't home, so I helped her up and walked her to my porch, where Helen could clean the wound and put a bandage on it. Maria leaned forward. Did you touch her scarf during this incident? Helen might have. She was always fussing over that child, straightening her clothes and making sure she was warm enough. Helen had a maternal instinct that never got fulfilled. We couldn't have children of our own. Robert's eyes filled with tears again. She would have done anything to protect Sarah. We both would have. The interview was interrupted by a knock on the door. Sheriff Thompson stepped inside and motioned for Maria to join him in the hallway. Maria, we've got a problem, Thompson said quietly once the door was closed. I just got off the phone with the state crime lab. They ran Robert's DNA through the extended database, and they found something interesting. What kind of something? The sample from Sarah's scarf. It's not a perfect match for Robert Henley. It's consistent with a close male relative, a brother, son, or father. Maria felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Robert mentioned he has a brother, said he was visiting him in Missoula the weekend Sarah disappeared. David Henley. I had dispatch run a background check. He died in a car accident in 1987, so we can't exactly question him now. But here's the interesting part. David was never married, never had children. According to the records, he lived alone his entire adult life. So if the DNA belongs to David, how do we prove it? And more importantly, how do we figure out what really happened that night? Thompson handed Maria a manila folder. I pulled David Henley's military records. He served 2 tours in Vietnam, came home with severe PTSD, had multiple arrests for disturbing the peace, public intoxication, and 1 incident where he was found wandering the streets in his underwear during a blizzard. Maria scanned the documents quickly. David Henley's photograph showed a man who bore a strong resemblance to his brother Robert, but his eyes held a haunted quality that was unmistakable. Sheriff, what if Robert has been protecting his brother all these years? What if David was the one in that dark car near Maple Street? That's what I'm thinking too. But we need more evidence before we can close this case. Dead men can't confess, and Robert's been consistent in his story so far. Maria looked through the interview room window at Robert, who sat staring at the wall with the expression of deep sorrow. I think Robert knows more than he's telling us. He's been carrying this burden for decades, but he's not ready to betray his brother's memory just yet. What do you want to do? Let me try a different approach. Sometimes the truth comes out when people think they're protecting someone they love. Maria returned to the interview room and sat down across from Robert again. This time she placed David Henley's military photograph on the table between them. Robert's reaction was immediate and devastating. His face went completely white, and his hands began shaking so violently that he knocked over his coffee cup. "Where did you get that picture?" he whispered. "Mr. Henley, I think it's time you told me about your brother David." Robert Henley stared at his brother's photograph for what felt like an eternity, his breathing shallow and labored. When he finally looked up at Maria, his eyes held the weight of nearly 5 decades of buried secrets. "David came home from Vietnam broken," Robert began, his voice barely audible. "He wasn't the same brother I'd grown up with. The war had done something terrible to his mind, filled it with shadows and nightmares that never went away." Maria kept her expression neutral, though her heart was racing. "Tell me about the night Sarah disappeared, Robert. Was David visiting you then?" "He wasn't supposed to be. I had told the police he was with me in Missoula, because that's what we had planned. But David had one of his episodes that week, couldn't handle being around people, couldn't sleep. He showed up at my house on December 22nd, 2 days early, driving that beat-up Buick of his." Robert wiped his eyes with a trembling hand. "Helen wanted to take him to the hospital, get him the help he needed. But David was terrified of doctors, convinced they were trying to poison him or control his mind. We'd tried before, and he always ran away. So he stayed at your house the night Sarah disappeared. Helen and I went to our Christmas party at the church. We left David alone because he seemed calmer that evening, watching television and eating the dinner Helen had made for him. When we came home around 11, he was gone." Maria leaned forward in her chair. "What time did you leave for the party?" "Around 7:30. The party didn't start until 8, but Helen wanted to help set up the decorations." Robert's hands clenched into fists. "David took the car keys from the kitchen counter. We found them there the next morning, along with a note apologizing for borrowing the Buick. Did you ask David where he had gone?" Robert was quiet for several minutes, staring at the table. When he spoke again, his voice was filled with anguish. "David was in a strange state the next morning. Kept talking about angels and demons, saying he had seen a little girl who needed help. He said the demons were chasing her, and he had tried to protect her." Maria felt a chill run down her spine. "What exactly did he say about this little girl?" "He described her perfectly. Blonde hair, red scarf, tears on her cheeks. Said she was walking toward the water where the demons couldn't follow her. He kept insisting that he had saved her from something terrible, that he was a guardian angel sent to protect innocent children." "Robert, did David ever hurt children?" "Never. David was gentle with everyone, especially kids. He had this way with them, like he understood their fears because he carried so many of his own." Robert looked directly at Maria for the first time since seeing the photograph. "Whatever happened to Sarah, I don't believe David intended to harm her." "Then what do you think happened that night?" Robert stood up and walked to the small window in the interview room, looking out at the snow-covered parking lot. "David's mind was fractured, Detective. He lived in a world where reality and hallucinations blended together. If he saw Sarah in distress, he would have tried to help her, but his idea of help might not have made sense to anyone else. Maria made careful notes, trying to piece together a timeline. The DNA evidence suggests David had physical contact with Sarah's scarf. How do you explain that? David always carried a backpack with him, filled with things he thought he might need. Food, blankets, first aid supplies. He had this compulsion to be prepared to help people, stemming from his guilt about the soldiers he couldn't save in Vietnam. Robert turned back to face Maria. If Sarah was cold or hurt, David would have wrapped her in something warm, maybe taken her somewhere he thought was safe. Like where? There was an old hunting cabin about 2 miles upstream from Winter Creek. David used to go there when his episodes got bad, said it was the only place where the voices in his head would quiet down. He'd stocked it with supplies, canned food, sleeping bags, kerosene heaters. Maria's pulse quickened. The cabin had never been mentioned in the original investigation. Is this cabin still standing? As far as I know, it belonged to our grandfather, built back in the 1940s. David inherited it when Grandpa died in 1975. After David's accident in 1987, I couldn't bring myself to go there. Too many painful memories. Robert, I need you to think carefully about this next question. Do you believe David killed Sarah Whitmore? Robert's face crumpled, and he began sobbing with a grief that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. I don't know, Detective. I've spent 46 years wondering, praying that my brother wasn't capable of such a thing. But David's mind was so damaged, and he was so confused about what was real and what wasn't. Why didn't you tell the police about David being at your house that night? Because I knew how it would look, a mentally ill veteran with a history of erratic behavior, alone during the time a child disappeared. They would have locked him up in some state hospital, and he would have died in there, not from his illness, but from fear and loneliness. Robert looked at Maria with desperate eyes. David was my little brother. I had promised our mother on her deathbed that I would take care of him, so you provided him with a false alibi. I told everyone he was with me because that's what I wished had been true. If I had stayed home that night instead of going to the Christmas party, none of this would have happened. Sarah would be alive, and David wouldn't have spent the rest of his short life haunted by whatever occurred in those woods. Maria closed her notebook and looked at Robert with a mixture of sympathy and frustration. Mr. Henley, we're going to need you to show us the location of this cabin. It's possible that Sarah's remains are there, and her family deserves to know what happened to her. Robert nodded slowly. Detective, there's something else you need to know about that cabin. David claimed it was haunted by the spirit of a little girl. He said she visited him there, telling him that she forgave him for not being able to save her. I always thought it was just another one of his delusions, but now what? Now I wonder if Sarah has been waiting there all these years, for someone to find her and bring her home. The trek through the snow-covered forest felt like walking into the past. Maria followed Robert Henley along an overgrown trail that wound through towering pines and bare aspens, their boots crunching on the frozen ground. The crime scene team followed behind them, carrying metal detectors, cameras, and excavation equipment. The temperature had dropped to 20 below zero, and their breath formed thick clouds in the brittle air. Maria's hands were numb despite her insulated gloves, and she could feel the cold seeping through her winter boots. Beside her, Robert moved with the careful steps of a man his age navigating treacherous terrain, but his familiarity with the path was evident. "How much further?" Deputy Morrison called from behind them, his voice muffled by the scarf wrapped around his face. "Just over that ridge," Robert replied, pointing to a small hill about a quarter-mile ahead. "The cabin sits in a clearing near a bend in the creek. David chose the spot because it's sheltered from the wind and gets good morning sunlight." As they crested the ridge, the hunting cabin came into view, and Maria felt her breath catch. The small log structure looked like something from a fairy tale, with icicles hanging from the eaves and snow piled high against the walls. Smoke was rising from the chimney. "Robert," Maria said slowly, "you said no one had been to this cabin since David died." Robert stopped abruptly, staring at the smoke with wide eyes. "That's impossible. I'm the only one who knows about this place, and I haven't been here in decades." Deputy Morrison drew his weapon. "Could be squatters or hunters using it illegally." Maria motioned for the team to spread out and approach cautiously. The windows of the cabin were dark, and no vehicles were visible in the clearing, but someone had definitely been there recently. Fresh footprints led from the cabin to the creek and back again. As they drew closer, Maria could see that the cabin was in remarkably good condition for a structure that had been abandoned for nearly 40 years. The logs showed no signs of rot, the roof appeared solid, and the windows were intact. It was as if time had stood still in this remote corner of the Montana wilderness. Maria knocked on the door, her other hand resting on her service weapon. "Police. Is anyone inside?" No response. She tried the door handle and found it unlocked. The door swung open with a soft creak, revealing an interior that took her breath away. The cabin was immaculate, as if someone had been maintaining it regularly. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Canned goods were neatly arranged on shelves, sleeping bags were folded precisely on 2 small cots, and kerosene lanterns hung from hooks in the ceiling. "This is exactly how David left it," Robert whispered, stepping inside behind Maria. "Even the same brands of food he used to stock. He always preferred Chef Boyardee ravioli and Campbell's soup." Maria noticed something else that made her skin crawl. The walls were covered with children's drawings, dozens of them, depicting scenes of forests, creeks, and small figures that appeared to be playing in the snow. The artwork looked fresh, as if it had been created recently. "Robert, did David draw these pictures?" David couldn't draw to save his life. He had severe tremors in his hands from the war. Robert examined one of the drawings more closely. "Detective, this shows a little girl in a red scarf. The same scarf Sarah was wearing in that photograph," Deputy Morrison called from the back of the cabin. "Detective Santos, you need to see this." Maria followed his voice to a small alcove near the rear window. There, arranged on a makeshift altar, were personal items that clearly belonged to a child. A pink hairbrush, a small stuffed rabbit, a pair of mittens, and a school notebook with Sarah Whitmore, grade 3 inches written on the cover in careful, cursive handwriting. "These are Sarah's belongings," Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This proves she was here." But it was what she saw next that made her blood run cold. Pinned to the wall above the altar was the original of the photograph that had been mailed to the sheriff's department, the very same image of Sarah standing by Winter Creek, but this copy was pristine, as if it had been carefully preserved for decades. Robert sank onto one of the cots, his face pale with shock. "I don't understand any of this. Who's been maintaining this place? Who collected Sarah's things?" Maria began photographing everything methodically, her mind racing with possibilities. The cabin felt inhabited, not just recently, but continuously. Someone had been caring for this place as if it were a shrine to Sarah Whitmore. "Detective," called Dr. Patricia Wells, who had arrived with the crime scene team. "I'm getting strong readings on the metal detector near the fireplace. Something's buried under the floorboards." Maria felt her heart sink. After 46 years, they might finally have found Sarah's remains. She gave Dr. Wells permission to begin excavation, then stepped outside to call Sheriff Thompson with an update. As she stood in the clearing making her call, Maria noticed something that hadn't been visible from inside the cabin. The fresh footprints in the snow didn't lead away from the clearing toward any road or trail. Instead, they simply stopped at the edge of the creek, as if whoever had made them had vanished into thin air. When she returned to the cabin, Dr. Wells was carefully removing floorboards near the hearth. "We've got something," she announced. "It's not human remains, though. Looks like a wooden box." The box, when finally extracted, was about the size of a shoebox and appeared to be handmade from pine boards. It was secured with a simple latch but no lock. Maria opened it carefully, not sure what to expect. Inside were dozens of photographs, all showing the same little blonde girl at different ages. Some appeared to be school photos, others were candid shots of her playing in yards, riding bicycles, and walking to school. At the bottom of the box was a leather journal filled with handwriting in blue ink. Maria opened the journal to the first page and read aloud. "My name is David Henley, and I am watching over Sarah Whitmore because I failed to protect her when she needed me most. These are the days since her death. Day 1, Day 2, Day 3. The entries continued for years, thousands of them, documenting David's obsession with the child he believed he had failed to save. But the final entry, dated just 3 days ago, was written in different handwriting entirely. "Sarah wants the truth to be told. She is tired of waiting. She has shown me where to find the man who really killed her. His name is Thomas Caldwell, and he still lives in Kalispell. Look for the blue Oldsmobile. A friend." Maria stared at the journal entry, her mind reeling. Thomas Caldwell was a name from the original investigation, a man who had been questioned briefly, but dismissed as a suspect when he provided what seemed like a solid alibi. And a blue Oldsmobile matched Robert's description of the car he had seen near Maple Street the night Sarah disappeared. But who had written this final entry? And how had they known details about the case that had never been made public? Thomas Caldwell's house sat on a quiet cul-de-sac in the older section of Kalispell, a modest two-story colonial with white aluminum siding and black shutters. Maria sat in her cruiser across the street, studying the property through binoculars while waiting for backup to arrive. In the driveway sat a faded blue 1974 Oldsmobile Cutlass, its paint oxidized, but its chrome still gleaming. The vehicle registration confirmed what she already suspected. Thomas Caldwell had owned this same car since 1976. For 49 years, he had been driving the vehicle that Robert Henley had seen parked near Maple Street the night Sarah Whitmore disappeared. Maria's radio crackled to life. "Detective Santos, this is Dispatch. We ran that background check on Thomas Caldwell like you requested. Go ahead. 73 years old, retired postal worker. Clean record except for a few traffic citations over the years. But here's what's interesting. He worked the Maple Street postal route from 1975 to 2010. He would have known all the families in Sarah's neighborhood, including their daily routines." A chill ran down Maria's spine. A postal worker would have had detailed knowledge of when families were home, when children walked to school, and when parents were at work. He would have been a familiar, trusted figure in the neighborhood. Deputy Morrison's patrol unit pulled up behind her cruiser, followed by another unit carrying Deputies Clark and Jensen. Maria gathered the team for a brief strategy meeting before approaching the house. "What's our legal standing here, Detective?" Deputy Morrison asked. "That journal entry isn't exactly probable cause. We've got enough to bring him in for questioning. The combination of the vehicle description, his connection to the neighborhood, and the fact that someone with knowledge of the case specifically named him gives us grounds to investigate." Maria checked her weapon and adjusted her body armor. "Remember, this man is in his 70s, but we don't know what we're walking into." As they approached the front door, Maria noticed that the house had an unusual number of security modifications for a residential property in a safe neighborhood. Multiple deadbolts, reinforced door frames, and security cameras positioned at every corner suggested someone who was either very paranoid or had something significant to hide. Maria knocked firmly on the door. "Mr. Caldwell, police. We need to speak with you." The door opened immediately, as if Thomas Caldwell had been waiting for them. He was a thin man with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the officers standing on his porch. His clothes were neat and pressed, and his posture was remarkably straight for someone his age. "Officers, what can I do for you?" His voice was calm and measured, showing no signs of surprise or nervousness. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm Detective Santos. We're investigating a cold case, and your name came up in connection with the disappearance of Sarah Whitmore in 1979. We'd like to ask you some questions." "Sarah Whitmore." Thomas repeated the name slowly, as if testing how it sounded. "That was the little girl who vanished around Christmas time, wasn't it? Tragic case. I remember delivering mail to her family for years after it happened. They never gave up hope." "Yes, sir. We understand you were questioned during the original investigation." "Briefly, I was delivering a package to the Anderson family 2 streets over when the police were canvassing the neighborhood. I told them what I knew, which wasn't much." Thomas gestured toward his living room. "Would you like to come in? It's awfully cold out there." Maria and Deputy Morrison followed him inside, while the other officers remained outside to secure the perimeter. The interior of the house was meticulously clean and organized, with everything in its proper place. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece, showing Thomas at various ages with what appeared to be siblings and their children. "Mr. Caldwell, we'd like to ask you about your whereabouts on the evening of December 23rd, 1979. "That's a very specific date from a very long time ago, Detective. I'm afraid I can't recall exactly what I was doing that particular evening." Maria pulled out her notebook. "According to the original police report, you stated that you were at home watching television with your wife that night." Thomas's expression didn't change, but Maria noticed his hands tighten slightly on the arms of his chair. "My wife Margaret passed away 15 years ago. I'm sure she corroborated whatever I told the police at the time." "Mr. Caldwell, I need to ask you directly. Did you have any contact with Sarah Whitmore on December 23rd, 1979? Wom. For the first time, Thomas showed a flicker of something. Annoyance, perhaps, or calculation. "Detective, I delivered mail to hundreds of families over my career. I may have spoken to Sarah in passing, the way any adult might acknowledge a child in the neighborhood, but I certainly didn't have any meaningful contact with her." Deputy Morrison spoke up. "Sir, we have a witness who saw a blue Oldsmobile parked near the Whitmore house that evening. That's the same make and model you drive." Thomas laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor. "Deputy, do you have any idea how many blue Oldsmobiles were on the roads in 1979? It was one of the most popular cars of that era." Maria decided to take a more aggressive approach. "Mr. Caldwell, we also have physical evidence linking you to Sarah's case. We're prepared to arrest you on suspicion of kidnapping and murder." The change in Thomas was immediate and dramatic. The facade of the helpful senior citizen vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. His eyes hardened, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a menacing undertone. "Detective Santos, I think you're fishing. If you had real evidence against me, you would have arrived with a warrant instead of polite questions." Thomas stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. "I've lived in this community for over 50 years. I've been a model citizen, paid my taxes, volunteered at church functions. You're going to need more than the word of some anonymous source to destroy my reputation. We're not trying to destroy anything, Mr. Caldwell. We're trying to find the truth about what happened to an 8-year-old girl." Thomas walked to the window and looked out at the other police officers positioned around his property. "The truth, Detective, is that some questions are better left unasked. Some doors are better left unopened." "Is that a threat, Mr. Caldwell?" "It's a statement of fact. I've watched this town for decades. I know where all the bodies are buried, metaphorically speaking. If you persist in this investigation, you might find that other secrets come to light. Secrets that certain people would prefer to remain hidden." Maria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Montana winter. Thomas Caldwell was admitting to knowledge of other crimes, other cover-ups. The Whitmore case might be just the tip of a much larger iceberg. "Mr. Caldwell, you're going to need to come with us for further questioning." Thomas smiled, but it was the smile of a predator who had been cornered but wasn't ready to surrender. "Am I under arrest, Detective?" "You are now." Maria began reading him his Miranda rights, but Thomas interrupted her. "Detective, before you take me away, you might want to check the basement. There are some things down there that will help you understand the full scope of what you're dealing with." The basement stairs creaked ominously as Maria descended into the darkness below Thomas Caldwell's house, her flashlight cutting through the musty air. Deputy Morrison followed close behind, while Thomas remained upstairs in custody with the other officers. The smell that greeted them was a mixture of mildew, old wood, and something else, something sweet and sickly that made Maria's stomach turn. The basement was larger than she had expected, stretching beneath the entire footprint of the house. Concrete walls lined with wooden shelving units created a maze-like environment, and Maria could hear the steady drip of water somewhere in the darkness. Her flashlight beam revealed cardboard boxes stacked floor to ceiling, each one carefully labeled with dates and names. "Jesus Christ," Deputy Morrison muttered, as his own flashlight illuminated a section of the far wall. "Detective, you need to see this." Maria followed his voice and found herself staring at what could only be described as a shrine to missing children. Dozens of newspaper clippings covered the wall, documenting disappearances that spanned 5 decades. School photographs of smiling children were pinned between the articles, connected by red string that formed a complex web of relationships and timelines. At the center of the display was a large photograph of Sarah Whitmore, surrounded by what appeared to be personal items: a hairbrush, a small toy car, a child's drawing of a house with a family standing in front of it. But Sarah's section of the wall was just one of many. Maria counted at least 20 different children represented in the macabre collection. "Morrison, start photographing everything. We're going to need a complete record of this." Maria moved deeper into the basement, her heart pounding as she realized the scope of what they had discovered. The cardboard boxes were organized chronologically, with the earliest dates going back to 1975. Maria opened one labeled Jennifer Hayes, 1,976 inches, and found it contained clothing that appeared to belong to a young girl, along with photographs and what looked like diary entries written in Thomas's precise handwriting. She read one entry aloud. "Jennifer fought harder than the others, had to use the rope to keep her quiet. She asked for her mother 17 times before she stopped asking for anything. Disposed of remains at mile marker 47 on Highway 93. Deputy Morrison's face had gone pale in the flashlight beam. "Detective, this guy isn't just a killer. He's been documenting his crimes like some kind of twisted journal." Maria continued searching through the boxes, finding similar contents in each one. Thomas Caldwell had been methodically kidnapping and murdering children for over 4 decades, keeping trophies and detailed records of each crime. The level of organization was both impressive and deeply disturbing. but it was what she found in the box labeled Sarah Whitmore, 1,979 inches, that nearly brought her to her knees. Along with items of Sarah's clothing and several photographs, there was a small cassette recorder and a handwritten note that read, "Recording made December 23rd, 1979, 10:47 p.m. Maria's hands shook as she inserted the cassette into a portable player she found among Thomas's equipment. After a moment of static, a child's voice filled the basement, frightened, confused, but unmistakably alive. "Please, mister, I want to go home. My mommy and daddy are going to be worried about me." Then Thomas's voice, younger but still recognizable. "Don't worry, Sarah, you're safe now. I'm going to take care of you. I'm cold. Can I have my scarf back?" "Your scarf is right here, sweetheart. But first, I need you to do something for me." The recording continued for several more minutes, documenting Thomas's manipulation of the terrified child. Maria had to stop the tape twice to compose herself, the reality of Sarah's final hours almost too much to bear. "Detective Santos," Deputy Morrison called from across the basement. "I found something else. There's a door back here hidden behind these shelves." Maria followed his voice to a section of the basement that had been concealed behind a false wall constructed of plywood and 2x4s. The hidden door was secured with multiple locks, and the wood around the frame showed signs of recent use. They forced the door open to reveal a small room that had been converted into what could only be described as a prison cell. The walls were lined with soundproofing material, and heavy chains were bolted to the concrete floor. A single mattress lay in the corner, stained with what appeared to be blood and other bodily fluids. But it was the wall opposite the door that made Maria's blood run cold. Carved into the concrete were dozens of names, scratched by fingernails, and what appeared to be pieces of metal. Sarah Whitmore was there, along with Jennifer Hayes and all the other children whose boxes were stored in the outer basement. "Morrison, we need to get the crime scene team down here immediately. And call the sheriff. We're going to need additional units and probably the FBI. This is bigger than just Sarah Whitmore." As they prepared to leave the basement, Maria noticed something that hadn't been visible from the stairs. In the far corner, almost hidden in the shadows, was a newer addition to the space. A small desk with a computer, surrounded by printing equipment and what appeared to be surveillance monitors. The computer was still running, its screen displaying a program that looked like a database. Maria cautiously approached and found herself looking at a comprehensive record system that contained information on hundreds of children, names, addresses, school schedules, family routines, and detailed notes about their daily movements. The most recent entries were dated just days ago, with photographs and information about children currently living in Kalispell. Thomas Caldwell hadn't stopped killing, he had simply become more careful about it. But what shocked Maria most was a folder on the desktop labeled Sarah's Friends. Inside were dozens of communications with someone identified only as DH, David Henley. The messages, dating back to 1980, revealed a twisted correspondence between two deeply disturbed men. The final message in the folder, sent just 1 week ago, was from David's account. "The police are getting close. Sarah won't let me rest until they know the truth. I'm going to tell them about you, Thomas. She visits me every night now and she's angry." Thomas's reply was chilling in its simplicity. "David died in 1987. Who is this?" The response came immediately. "Someone who has been waiting 46 years to make sure justice is served." Maria stared at the computer screen, her mind racing. Someone had been impersonating David Henley, communicating with Thomas Caldwell, and orchestrating this entire investigation. But who? And how had they gained access to information that only the real David could have known? As she prepared to shut down the computer and preserve it as evidence, one final message appeared on the screen, posted just minutes ago. "Detective Santos, you're very close now. Look for the place where the creek bends toward the old mill. Sarah is waiting there. She has been waiting for someone brave enough to bring her home. A friend." The old Kalispell mill had been abandoned since the 1950s, its weathered wooden structures now serving as a monument to the town's logging past. Maria stood on the bank of Winter Creek as it curved around the mill's foundation, watching the crime scene team set up their equipment in the fading afternoon light. The temperature had dropped even further, and ice crystals hung in the air like tiny diamonds. Thomas Caldwell sat in the back of a patrol car nearby, staring out the window with an expression that seemed almost satisfied. He had refused to say anything more about the location, claiming only that Sarah will show you where to look when she's ready. "Detective Santos," called Dr. Patricia Wells from the State Crime Lab. We're getting strong readings about 30 yards downstream from the mill. The ground-penetrating radar is showing something significant buried about 4 feet down. Maria felt her stomach clench. After 46 years, they were finally going to find Sarah's remains. She had called the Whitmore family earlier to prepare them for what might be discovered, and Sarah's mother, now in her 70s, had wept openly on the phone. "How long will the excavation take?" Maria asked. "With this frozen ground, probably several hours. We want to be careful not to disturb any evidence that might still be preserved." As the team began the painstaking process of excavation, Maria noticed something odd about the location. The mill bend was clearly visible from the road, yet somehow no one had thought to search here during the original investigation. When she mentioned this to Sheriff Thompson, who had arrived to oversee the operation, his expression grew troubled. "Maria, I was a deputy back then, and I specifically remember suggesting we search near the old mill. My supervisor at the time, Detective Raymond Walsh, said he had already checked the area and found nothing." "Where is Detective Walsh now?" "Died of a heart attack in 1995, but Maria, Walsh lived just 3 houses down from Thomas Caldwell. They were neighbors for over 20 years. The implication hit Maria like a physical blow. The original investigation had been compromised from the beginning, with one of the lead detectives potentially covering for Thomas Caldwell. How many other children might have been saved if the case had been properly investigated in 1979? "Detective Santos," Dr. Wells called urgently from the excavation site. "We've found something, but it's not what we expected." Maria hurried to the edge of the excavation pit, where the crime scene team had carefully exposed a small wooden coffin, handmade from pine boards and sealed with what appeared to be paraffin wax. The level of preservation was remarkable, suggesting that whoever had buried it had taken great care to protect its contents. "The coffin appears to be child-sized," Dr. Wells continued, "but there's something else. It's been placed on top of a much older burial site. The radar is showing additional remains beneath this one." As they carefully lifted the wooden coffin from the ground, Maria noticed that someone had carved words into the lid. "Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore, beloved daughter, taken too soon. Justice will come." Inside the coffin, wrapped in what appeared to be a child's bedsheet, were indeed human remains that seemed consistent with those of an 8-year-old girl. But along with the bones were items that made Maria's breath catch: the red knitted scarf perfectly preserved, and a small metal locket that Sarah had been wearing the night she disappeared. "Dr. Wells, how long will it take to confirm the identity through DNA? With the preservation quality, I should have preliminary results within 24 hours. But Detective, there's something else you need to see." "Doctor." Wells led Maria to a section of the coffin that had been hidden beneath Sarah's remains. There, carved into the wood, was a message in different handwriting. "Thomas Caldwell killed me on December 24th, 1979. David Henley found my body on January 3rd, 1980, and buried me here so my family could find me someday. I forgive David for not being able to save me. I do not forgive Thomas for taking my life." Maria stared at the message, her mind racing. David Henley had found Sarah's body 3 weeks after her disappearance and had given her a proper burial, even carving a makeshift headstone. But how had he known where to look? And why hadn't he contacted the police? Her radio crackled to life. "Detective Santos, this is Deputy Morrison. Thomas Caldwell is asking to speak with you. Says he's ready to confess, but only to you." Maria looked back at the excavation site, where the team was now beginning to uncover the older remains beneath Sarah's coffin. Whatever secrets were buried here, she had a feeling they were about to reshape everything she thought she knew about this case. She walked back to the patrol car where Thomas sat waiting, his eyes focused on something in the distance that only he could see. "Mr. Caldwell, I understand you want to make a statement." Thomas turned to look at her, and for the first time since his arrest, his composure seemed to crack slightly. "Detective, I want to tell you about the night Sarah died. But first, I need you to understand something about David Henley." "What about David?" "David didn't kill Sarah, but he didn't save her either. He found us at the mill that night, after I had already finished with her. He was in one of his episodes talking to voices that weren't there, convinced he was some kind of guardian angel." Maria felt sick, but she forced herself to listen. "What happened then?" "David begged me to let him take care of her body. Said the spirits were telling him she deserved a proper burial, not to be dumped somewhere like trash. He was crying, actually crying over a child he barely knew." Thomas's voice carried a note of genuine puzzlement, as if he couldn't understand such emotion. "So you let him take her?" "I let him think he was helping her. It kept him quiet, kept him from going to the police." David was so damaged that he actually believed he was doing something noble by burying her. Thomas paused, staring at the excavation site. "But, Detective, there's something else about David that you need to know." "What?" "David Henley didn't die in a car accident in 1987. Maria felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "What do you mean?" "I mean David Henley has been very much alive for the past 38 years. And if I'm right, he's the one who's been orchestrating this entire investigation." Thomas smiled with the satisfied expression of a man who had been waiting decades to reveal his final secret. "Detective, I think it's time you met the real David Henley." Maria stared at Thomas Caldwell in disbelief. "That's impossible. We have death records, accident reports, burial documentation. David Henley died in 1987. Thomas chuckled, a sound devoid of any warmth. "Detective, you'd be amazed what a man can accomplish when he has nothing left to lose and decades to plan. David staged his own death after he realized I would never face justice for what I had done to Sarah and the others." "Others?" "Oh yes, Detective. Sarah wasn't my first and she wasn't my last. David knew about all of them because I told him. I thought his damaged mind would keep my secrets safe, but I underestimated his sense of justice." Thomas leaned back in his seat, his eyes focused on something beyond the patrol car window. "David spent years gathering evidence against me, documenting my crimes, building a case that no court could ignore." Maria's mind raced as she tried to process this information. If David has been alive all this time, why wait until now to come forward? Because David needed the technology to catch up with his evidence. That DNA analysis you ran on Sarah's scarf? David has been waiting for forensic science to advance enough to make his case ironclad. Thomas turned to look directly at Maria. "Detective, David Henley has spent the last 38 years becoming the perfect witness against me." Before Maria could respond, her radio erupted with urgent chatter. "Detective Santos, we have a situation at the excavation site. You need to get over here immediately." Maria ran back to where the crime scene team was working, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. What she found there defied all rational explanation. Standing at the edge of the excavation pit was a man in his 70s, wearing the same type of military field jacket that appeared in David Henley's service photos. His hair was white and his face was deeply lined, but his eyes held the same haunted quality that Maria had seen in the old photographs. "Detective Santos," the man said in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "My name is David Henley, and I've been waiting a very long time to meet you." Dr. Wells and the crime scene team stood frozen, unsure how to react to the sudden appearance of a man who was supposed to be dead. Sheriff Thompson had his hand on his weapon, but something in David's demeanor suggested he posed no threat. "Mr. Henley," Maria said carefully, "we were told you died in 1987. David smiled sadly. "I died inside in 1980, when I realized I could have saved Sarah if I had been braver that night. The car accident in 1987 simply gave me the opportunity to disappear legally and dedicate my life to making sure Thomas Caldwell faced justice." "How did you fake your death?" "The accident was real, Detective. I was in a coma for 3 weeks, and when I woke up, the hospital staff told me that my family had already held a memorial service because they thought I wouldn't survive." David moved closer to the excavation site, looking down at the small coffin that contained Sarah's remains. "I realized it was the perfect opportunity to become someone else, to investigate Thomas without him knowing I was still alive." Maria studied David's face, looking for signs of deception. "What name have you been living under?" "David Miller, retired park ranger. I've been living in a cabin about 50 miles from here, maintaining the illusion that I was just another hermit who preferred the mountains to civilization." David knelt beside Sarah's coffin, his hands shaking as he reached toward the carved message. "But I never stopped watching Thomas, Detective. I never stopped gathering evidence." "You're the one who sent the anonymous photograph to the sheriff's department." "Yes, and I'm the one who's been maintaining the hunting cabin where Robert thought I used to go. I needed a place to store my evidence, and I needed to make sure that when the time came, investigators would find everything they needed to understand the full scope of Thomas's crimes." Sheriff Thompson stepped forward. "Mr. Henley, if you've been alive all this time, why didn't you come forward sooner? You could have prevented other children from being killed." David's face crumpled with a grief that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. "Sheriff, I tried. In 1990, I contacted the FBI with a detailed report about Thomas, including evidence I had gathered over 10 years. They dismissed me as a mentally unstable veteran making wild accusations against a respected member of the community. What kind of evidence? David reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. Photographs, audio recordings, physical evidence from crime scenes, everything you found in Thomas's basement, I've had copies of for decades. But without the DNA technology to tie Thomas directly to the crimes, it was all circumstantial. Maria opened the envelope and found herself looking at photographs that clearly showed Thomas Caldwell with several of the missing children, along with detailed maps marking burial sites and disposal locations. David, how did you get these photographs? I followed Thomas for years, Detective. He thought he was invisible, thought his position in the community protected him from suspicion. He became careless, arrogant. David's voice carried a cold anger that sent chills down Maria's spine. Thomas never realized that the crazy Vietnam vet he had confided in was actually documenting his every move. Dr. Wells called from the excavation site. Detective Santos, we've uncovered the older remains. This appears to be another child, probably buried several years before Sarah. David nodded grimly. Jennifer Hayes, 8 years old, disappeared in 1976. Thomas told me he buried her there as practice for when he killed Sarah. He said the mill bend was the perfect location because the soil was soft and the sound of the creek would mask any noise. Maria felt sick as the full scope of Thomas Caldwell's crimes became clear. David, how many children are we talking about? 23 confirmed victims over 4 decades, Detective. I have evidence linking Thomas to disappearances in 3 different states. David stood slowly, his movements showing the weight of his years and the burden he had been carrying. But Sarah was special. Thomas kept talking about her, kept revisiting the crime scene. She haunted him in a way the others didn't. What do you mean? David looked back at the small coffin where Sarah's remains lay. Thomas started having nightmares after he killed Sarah. He would wake up screaming about a little girl in a red scarf who was standing at the foot of his bed, asking why he had hurt her. He became obsessed with the idea that Sarah's spirit was somehow more powerful than the others. Maria stared at David, trying to process everything she had learned. David, I need to ask you directly. Did you kill Thomas Caldwell? David's expression was unreadable. Detective, Thomas Caldwell is very much alive, but I can't promise he'll stay that way much longer. Sarah has been very patient, but even the dead have their limits. As if summoned by David's words, a scream echoed across the excavation site from the direction of the patrol car where Thomas was being held. Maria and the other officers ran toward the sound, their weapons drawn. They found Thomas Caldwell pressed against the back window of the patrol car, his eyes wide with terror as he stared at something only he could see. She's here, he whispered. Sarah's here, and she's not alone. The temperature around the patrol car had dropped at least 20 degrees, and Maria's breath formed thick clouds as she approached the vehicle where Thomas Caldwell cowered in terror. The windows had fogged over completely, except for small handprints that appeared to be pressed against the glass from the inside, child-sized handprints that couldn't possibly belong to Thomas. Get him out of there, Maria ordered Deputy Morrison, who was fumbling with the car keys with hands that shook from more than just the cold. When they opened the door, Thomas practically fell out of the vehicle, scrambling backward on his hands and knees until he reached the trunk of a nearby pine tree. His face was pale and his eyes darted frantically around the excavation site. They're everywhere, Thomas gasped, pointing at empty spaces in the air. All of them. Jennifer, Michael, Lisa, Sarah, they're all here and they're angry. Maria looked around the site and saw only her fellow officers and the crime scene team, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched by unseen eyes. Even the hardened deputies seemed uneasy, constantly looking over their shoulders and speaking in hushed tones. David Henley approached Thomas slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. They've been waiting for this moment for decades, Thomas, waiting for justice. You don't understand, Thomas pleaded, his voice cracking with fear. I never meant for it to go this far. It started with just one, just Jennifer, and then I couldn't stop. Something inside me was broken, and I couldn't fix it. 23 children, Thomas. 23 families destroyed because you couldn't control your urges. David knelt down so he was at Thomas's eye level. Do you know what it's like to carry their voices in your head for 46 years? To see their faces every time you close your eyes? Maria stepped between them, concerned that David might take justice into his own hands. Mr. Henley, we need to let the legal system handle this now. The legal system failed these children once, Detective. What makes you think it won't fail them again? Before Maria could respond, Dr. Wells called urgently from the excavation site. "Detective Santos, you need to see this. We've found something that changes everything." Maria left Thomas under guard with Deputy Morrison and hurried back to the pit where the crime scene team had been working. What she saw there made her question everything she thought she understood about the case. Carved into the bottom of the excavation pit, in letters that appeared to be burned into the earth itself, was a message. "Thomas Caldwell will face justice on February 14th, 2025, at the place where Winter Creek meets the Flathead River. Come alone, Detective Santos, and bring the truth with you." "Dr. Wells, how is this possible? We've been excavating this site for hours, and no one reported seeing this message before." "Detective, I've been in forensic science for 25 years and I've never seen anything like this. The letters appear to be seared into the soil at a molecular level, but there's no evidence of heat or chemical burning. It's as if the earth itself wrote this message." Maria stared at the carved words, trying to find a rational explanation. February 14th was tomorrow, Valentine's Day, a strange choice for a supernatural confrontation. But then she remembered something from the original case files. Sarah Whitmore's birthday had been February 14th. She would have turned 55 tomorrow. "David," Maria called, "do you know anything about this message?" David approached the pit and looked down at the burned letters with an expression that mixed sadness and resignation. "Sarah always said she would get justice on her birthday, Detective. She's been planning this for 46 years. Planning what exactly?" "Thomas's Judgment Day. The spirits of the children he killed have been gathering strength, waiting for the right moment to claim him." David looked directly at Maria, his eyes filled with an otherworldly knowledge. "Detective, tomorrow night at the confluence of Winter Creek and the Flathead River, Thomas Caldwell will face the final court of justice." Sheriff Thompson had been listening to the conversation with growing alarm. "David, we can't allow vigilante justice, supernatural or otherwise. Thomas will be tried in a court of law." "Sheriff, with all due respect, your courts have had 46 years to find the truth about Sarah's disappearance. It took the intervention of forces beyond this world to finally bring Thomas to justice." David turned back to the message carved in the earth. "The children he killed deserve their day in court, and tomorrow night they're going to get it." Maria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Montana winter. "David, what exactly is going to happen tomorrow night?" "Thomas is going to confess to every crime he's committed, Detective. He's going to provide the locations of every burial site, the names of every victim, and the details of every murder. And when he's finished, the spirits are going to decide whether he deserves to live with that knowledge or join his victims in whatever comes next." Thomas, who had been listening from his position by the tree, let out a howl of terror. "You can't do this to me. I have rights. I demand police protection." David walked over to Thomas and crouched down beside him. "You forfeited your rights when you took the first child, Thomas. Tomorrow night you're going to face the consequences of every choice you made. And if I refuse to go to this meeting," David's smile was cold and merciless, "then the children will come to you, Thomas. They'll visit you in your cell, in your dreams, in every quiet moment for the rest of your life. At least at Winter Creek, you'll have the chance to ask for their forgiveness." Maria looked around the excavation site at her fellow officers, all of whom seemed to be struggling with the same question. How do you police the supernatural? How do you protect a child killer from the ghosts of his victims? "David, I can't officially sanction this meeting, but if Thomas chooses to cooperate with our investigation, and if that cooperation happens to take place at Winter Creek tomorrow night, then I suppose we'll be there to witness his confession." David nodded slowly. "Detective, bring recording equipment and a camera. The world needs to hear Thomas's confession, and the families of his victims deserve to know the truth about what happened to their children." As the crime scene team began packing up their equipment, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow night would be the most important and possibly the most terrifying moment of her career. Sarah Whitmore had waited 46 years for justice, and she was about to get it in a way that no court of law could provide. The spirits of Winter Creek were calling for judgment, and Thomas Caldwell was about to answer for his crimes. February 14th arrived with an eerie stillness that seemed to blanket all of northwestern Montana. Maria had spent the previous night reviewing every piece of evidence they had gathered, preparing for what might be Thomas Caldwell's final confession. She had also made peace with the possibility that she was about to witness something that would challenge everything she believed about life, death, and justice. The confluence of Winter Creek and the Flathead River sat in a natural amphitheater, surrounded by towering pines and snow-covered boulders. Maria arrived at sunset, carrying recording equipment and accompanied by David Henley, who had insisted on being present for what he called Sarah's birthday celebration. Thomas Caldwell had been transported from the county jail in shackles, his requests for protective custody denied when he couldn't provide a rational explanation for what he claimed to be supernatural threats. He sat on a fallen log near the water's edge, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line, as if expecting to see ghostly figures emerging from the shadows. "Detective Santos," Thomas said when he saw Maria approaching, "you have to understand that I never wanted to hurt those children. Something inside me was broken, something I couldn't control. Thomas, you've had 46 years to explain yourself. Tonight, we're here to listen to the truth, all of it." David positioned himself on a boulder overlooking the confluence, his weathered face reflecting the last rays of sunlight. "Thomas, the children are waiting. They've been patient, but their patience is running out." As darkness began to fall, the temperature dropped dramatically. Maria's breath formed thick clouds, and she noticed that the usually rushing waters of both the creek and river had begun to slow, as if some unseen force was gradually bringing them to a standstill. "It's starting," David whispered. "Can you feel them gathering?" Maria couldn't see anything unusual, but she could definitely feel a presence, or multiple presences, surrounding them. The air itself seemed to thicken, and she found herself struggling to breathe normally. Thomas began to shake violently. "They're here. Oh God, they're all here." "Then talk to them, Thomas," David commanded. "Tell them what you did to each of them. Start with Jennifer Hayes in 1976. Thomas looked around wildly, his eyes focusing on spaces where Maria saw nothing. "Jennifer. I'm sorry, Jennifer. I saw you walking home from school that day, and something inside me snapped. I offered you a ride home, and when you got in my car, I couldn't let you go." The water in both the creek and river had now completely stopped flowing, creating an unnatural silence that made Thomas's voice echo off the surrounding rocks. "Where did you take her, Thomas?" David's voice was steady, but Maria could see tears streaming down his face. "To the old quarry north of town. I kept her there for 3 days before she stopped fighting." Thomas was now openly sobbing. "I buried her body in the woods behind the quarry, near the big oak tree with the lightning scar." Maria made careful notes, documenting locations that would allow recovery teams to find Jennifer's remains. But as Thomas continued his confession, she began to notice something extraordinary happening around them. Small lights had begun appearing in the darkness, dozens of them, hovering about 4 feet off the ground and arranged in a circle around the confluence. As Maria watched, the lights began to take on vague human shapes like children made of starlight. "Michael Patterson," Thomas continued, his voice breaking. 1978. I took him from the playground behind the elementary school. Sarah Coleman, 1983, from her own backyard while her parents were at work. Lisa Brennan, 1985, from the bus stop on Elm Street. With each name Thomas spoke, another light appeared in the circle. Maria counted 23 distinct figures by the time Thomas finished his litany of crimes. At the center of the circle, slightly brighter than the others, was a small figure wearing what appeared to be a red scarf that glowed like a beacon in the darkness. "Sarah," David whispered. "She's beautiful." The figure Maria assumed was Sarah began to move closer to Thomas, who was now cowering on the ground with his arms wrapped around his head. When the ghostly child spoke, her voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Mr. Thomas, why did you hurt us?" Thomas looked up at the glowing figure with tear-filled eyes. "I don't know, Sarah. I was sick inside, broken in ways I didn't understand. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." "Sorry isn't enough." Sarah's voice carried the weight of nearly half a century of injustice. "You took our lives, our futures, our family's happiness. What can you give us in return?" Thomas struggled to his feet, his shackles clanking in the supernatural silence. "I'll tell them everything, every location, every detail, every victim. I'll make sure all the families know what happened to their children." The circle of ghostly children began to close in around Thomas, their lights growing brighter and more intense. Maria found herself holding her breath, unsure whether she was witnessing justice or revenge. "Thomas Caldwell," Sarah's voice now carried an authority that seemed to come from beyond the grave. "For 46 years, you have lived with the knowledge of our suffering while our families lived with questions and false hope. For 46 years, you have walked free while we remained trapped between life and death, unable to rest until justice was served." The lights surrounding Thomas began to pulse in unison, creating a rhythm like a cosmic heartbeat. Maria could feel the power building in the air around them, a force that seemed to draw energy from the very earth itself. "We offer you a choice," Sarah continued. "Spend the rest of your natural life in prison, haunted by our voices and tormented by the memory of what you did to us, or what? Thomas whispered. Join us now and know the fear and pain you caused us for eternity. Thomas looked around the circle of ghostly children, his face a mask of terror and despair. For a long moment, the only sound was the supernatural silence of the stopped waters and the rapid beating of Maria's heart. I choose prison, Thomas finally gasped. I choose to live with what I've done and help the families find their children. I don't deserve peace even in death. Sarah's glowing figure nodded slowly. Then live, Thomas Caldwell. Live with your guilt and your nightmares. Live knowing that every night when you close your eyes, we will be there to remind you of the price of your sins. The circle of lights began to fade, one by one, until only Sarah remained. She turned to David and Maria, her ghostly form flickering like candlelight. Thank you, she said simply. Thank you for never giving up, for never forgetting us. And then she was gone, and the waters of Winter Creek and the Flathead River began to flow again, carrying with them the echoes of 46 years of injustice finally put to rest. 6 months later, Maria Santos stood in the Kalispell Cemetery, watching as the last of 23 small caskets was lowered into the ground. Thomas Caldwell's detailed confessions had led to the recovery of every child's remains, allowing families to finally lay their loved ones to rest after decades of uncertainty and pain. Sarah Whitmore's funeral had been the largest, with hundreds of community members attending to pay their respects to the little girl, whose spirit had refused to rest until justice was served. Her parents, now both in their 70s, had wept as they finally said goodbye to their daughter, clutching the red scarf that had become the key piece of evidence in solving her murder. Thomas Caldwell sat in a maximum security prison in Deer Lodge, serving 23 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. True to Sarah's promise, he was reportedly haunted by nightmares every night, frequently found by guards talking to empty corners of his cell and begging invisible children for forgiveness that would never come. Detective Raymond Walsh's role in covering up the crimes had been exposed posthumously, leading to a review of dozens of other cold cases from his tenure. The corruption scandal had rocked the sheriff's department, but it had also led to important reforms in how missing children cases were investigated and documented. David Henley had finally come out of hiding officially, reclaiming his identity and receiving recognition for his decades-long investigation that had ultimately brought Thomas to justice. The Veterans Administration had awarded him full disability benefits for his PTSD and provided him with the mental health care he had needed for so long. Detective Santos, David said, approaching Maria as the cemetery began to empty after Sarah's service, I wanted to thank you for believing me, even when the evidence seemed impossible. David, I have to ask you something that's been bothering me for months. When we found you at the excavation site that day, how did you know to be there at that exact moment? David smiled, but his eyes held the same haunted quality they had carried since Vietnam. Detective, I've been having dreams about Sarah for 46 years. But the night before you found Thomas's basement, she came to me in a dream and told me it was time. She said the living needed to see justice done, not just the dead. Do you still see her? Do any of them still visit you? Sometimes, but now they come in peace, not in torment. They're at rest now, Detective. Finally at rest. Maria looked around the cemetery at the fresh graves, each one marked with a simple headstone bearing the name of a child whose life had been cut tragically short. The red roses that had been placed on each grave by anonymous donors were already beginning to bloom despite the February cold. David, what will you do now? Where will you go? I've bought a small house near the old mill close to where we found Sarah. I want to maintain the area, make sure it becomes a place of peace rather than a place of horror. David paused, looking toward the mountains that surrounded Kalispell. And I want to write down everything that happened, Detective. The families deserve to have the complete story, and the world needs to understand that sometimes justice comes in ways we don't expect. Maria nodded, understanding the importance of preserving the truth about what had occurred. David, one more question. Do you believe Sarah and the other children are truly at peace now? David was quiet for a long moment, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Detective, I think they've moved on to whatever comes next, but I also think they're watching over us, making sure that other children are protected from monsters like Thomas Caldwell. As they prepared to leave the cemetery, Maria noticed something that made her smile. Fresh snow had begun to fall, and the flakes were landing on the graves in patterns that looked almost like tiny handprints, child-sized handprints that seemed to be waving goodbye. 3 years later, Detective Maria Santos received a letter at the sheriff's department. It was postmarked from Seattle and bore no return address, but the handwriting was familiar. Inside was a newspaper clipping about a missing child case that had been solved when an anonymous tip led police to evidence that had been overlooked for months. At the bottom of the clipping, someone had written in the same handwriting that had appeared in David Henley's journal, "Some spirits never rest as long as children need protection. S.W." Maria filed the letter in a special folder she kept in her desk drawer, along with similar tips and clippings that had arrived over the years. Sarah Whitmore's spirit might have found peace, but her dedication to protecting other children continued from beyond the grave. The red scarf that had started it all was now displayed in the Flathead County Sheriff's Department lobby, along with a plaque that read, "In memory of Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore and all the children whose voices refuse to be silenced. Justice may be delayed, but it will never be denied." And sometimes, late at night when Maria worked alone in the office, she could swear she heard the sound of children's laughter echoing through the building, as if Sarah and her friends were playing somewhere just out of sight, finally free to be the children they had never had the chance to become. Winter Creek continued to flow toward the Flathead River, carrying with it the memories of that supernatural February night when the dead had spoken for themselves and justice had finally been served. The old mill still stood as a monument to the past, but now it was also a symbol of hope, proof that no matter how long it takes, the truth will always find a way to surface. In Kalispell, Montana, on quiet winter evenings when the snow falls softly on the frozen ground, residents sometimes report seeing a small figure in a red scarf walking along Winter Creek, not as a harbinger of tragedy, but as a guardian angel watching over the children of the community, making sure they make it safely home. Sarah Whitmore had waited 46 years for justice, and in the end, she had found not just closure for herself, but peace for all the children who had suffered the same fate. Her story had become a testament to the power of persistence, the importance of never giving up on the innocent, and the enduring belief that love and justice are stronger than death itself. The case was closed, but Sarah's legacy lived on, a reminder that some stories never truly end. They just transform into something larger than themselves, becoming part of the fabric of a community that refuses to forget its lost children and never stops fighting for those who cannot fight for themselves.